It's my great pleasure today to be hosting this webinar with today's guest, Chris Voliano. And Chris, kia ora to you, all the way from New Zealand. You're sitting in Ohio, such a long way away, and you've just had your dinner, I understand. So thank you so much for being here at such an odd time of the day. I first met Chris when he was based in Wellington doing his PhD at Massey University, and he tells me he's in the end stages of that PhD, which must be such a relief. Chris is now the technical advisor of food systems with the United States Agency for International Development. And today, Chris, it's a delight to be talking to you because I know how passionate you are about food sustainability and systems, and really look forward to sharing your messages. So kia ora to you, and welcome to our listeners on board. Chris, it's all yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alison. Hold on, let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay. Wonderful. Can you see?
That's perfect, Chris. Yes.
Great. All right. Kia ora koutou, everyone. My name is Chris Voliano, and thank you, Alison, for saying my last name in Italian. Not everyone can say it correctly, so I appreciate that. It's really nice to be here today and to be talking about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart and has been for nearly a decade now, and likely is appearing more and more in radars of those on the call today, because it's a topic that's pretty pertinent to 2021, and hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll find some interesting facts and hopefully be able to potentially even take some action afterwards. As Alison mentioned, my background is working across the food system for actually now over a decade, ranging from working with inner city, low income East Cleveland residents, which is in Ohio. They're some of the lowest income communities in the United States, all the way to working with indigenous food systems during my PhD in Pacific small island developing states, notably Solomon Islands. So I've had a diverse range of experiences, and I'm really grateful for that. And then, yeah, as Alison said, I'm now working with USAID Advancing Nutrition as the technical advisor of food systems on an entire team dedicated to food systems, which is really inspiring, honestly, just to see that organizations are moving towards this systems-based approach towards solving inequities and improving diet quality. I also want to mention that I am the co-founder of Food and Planet, which is a nonprofit focused on empowering healthcare professionals to become leaders in sustainable food systems. And I have a slide on that later, so I can go into more detail on that. I will say that now sustainable diets are more important than ever. And COVID has really kind of lifted the veils, revealing the inequities and opportunities to improve the health of people and the planet. And I also want to state that while food systems are global, they're also highly contextual, and it's really important to understand that piece when working with a population or an individual. Where's the community? What is the food environment like? All of those are really important questions. All right, let's see if I can advance slides. There we go. For those of you who like learning objectives, these are 3 learning objectives I hope to accomplish by the end of this short webinar, which is just describing how food systems integrate with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, listing the 4 dimensions of sustainable diets, and describing 3 similarities between healthy diets and sustainable diet patterns. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I wanted to start off, addressing the elephant in the room. Right now, our food systems are not sustainable. Modern food systems are so big and so unsustainable that they're actually endangering the very environmental systems that support the food systems to grow in the first place. I know that Professor Boyd Swinburne was on here maybe a few weeks ago doing a webinar with ANA, and he's really a leader in this space. And he defined a term recently called the global syndemic, which He likely mentioned I was unable to make that webinar, but it really is the triple threat of undernutrition, overnutrition, and climate change. And nowhere is this more apparent than in Pacific Small Island developing states and those low-lying nations that are impacted directly by climate change and the adverse impacts of an unhealthy diet. So why are modern diets unsustainable? For one, there are too many ultra-processed, nutrient-poor foods in our food system, and those are rising in all countries, low, middle, and high-income countries. The dietary diversity of our food system is dwindling. And I have a question for you guys. Let's see if I can pull up the chat here to see. So my question for you is, 3 crops now make up over 60% of the world's calories. What are those 3 crops? And Allison, I may need your help here because I don't think I can see the chat box, at least not from my screen here.
Okay,
so.
if you could type your answers into the question and answer box. We have wheat, soya, corn, corn, rice and coffee, wheat, sugar cane and corn and soy, wheat, sugar cane, corn, soy. We've got a lot of corn and soys.
Corn and soy.
Wheat,
well,
corn and rice, wheat. Okay,
palm.
We've got palm. Someone's put palm in there. Nothing different. So we're pretty limited on our choices there, Chris. How good are we?
Some of you answered it spot on, and collectively, you all got it right. It's actually rice, corn, and wheat are the top 3 crops that make up over 60% of the world's calories. Though that being said, palm, soy, sugar, those sorts of foods are likely close behind. And that just goes to show that the basis of our food system, it's based on a very limited number of species. And that's not really advantageous from a health perspective, nor a climate resiliency perspective. And to add insult to injury, producing that low dietary diversity within our food system is actually the leading driver of biodiversity losses globally. This picture in the background is actually the Amazon rainforest being deforested to grow soy for cattle or for pasture land for cattle. And the IPBES in 2019 released a report saying that 65% of deforestation can be linked to cattle ranching. And also over 50% of all zoonotic infectious diseases are linked to food systems. And those are expected to accelerate over the next few years as we continue to kind of make species, reduce the amount of land that they have to live in, and then they have to kind of consolidate closer and closer together and intermix with humans. So not a great thing as we've experienced over the past year and during this pandemic. And overall, greenhouse gas emissions are really strong coming from the food system. 20 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions are linked to agricultural production, consumption, and waste. And of that percentage, livestock contributes nearly 2/3 of all agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. I want to take just a brief moment to talk about agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of confusion in this space, and I just thought it would be really nice to kind of lay it out. So carbon dioxide is kind of probably what most people think of when we think of greenhouse gases and climate change, and that's very true. It's the most prominent. There's a term called global warming potential, which is essentially the greenhouse gas emissions impact towards climate change and the length of its half-life, how long it's in the system. And the baseline is carbon dioxide, which is a global warming potential of 1, as you can see. Overall contribution is weak, but it is the most prominent one. It comes from transportation, driving, any sort of engine, automobiles, etc. Methane is way more potent. It's 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide, a very strong contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And the primary source of methane in agriculture are from ruminant livestock, such as cow, lamb, as well as rice production and food waste, which is frankly one of the dumbest problems we have, but it is a very serious problem and requires significant attention. Once food enters the landfill, it rots. That rotting creates methane, and not only is that wonderful nutritious food going to waste, it's also contributing to climate change. And last but not least is nitrous oxide. This is a very strong GWP with 300 times that of carbon dioxide. And this typically comes from soil mismanagement and the addition of synthetic fertilizers. When nitrogen is added to the soil, the microbiome or microbes of the soil convert that to nitrous oxide. It's released into the atmosphere, and that's not so great. So this chart does a really good job. It's from the World Resource Institute. Highly recommend checking out this organization. They do a lot of data visualization around food's planetary impacts. But this chart's really nice because it shows you commonly consumed foods and their land use in the green bar on the left, the fresh water use, which is the blue bar in the middle, and the greenhouse gas emissions, which is the orange bar on the right. And the dotted line down the middle of the graph separates plant-based foods from animal-sourced foods. So you can see that there's a clear trend here that animal-sourced foods do have higher planetary impacts from land, freshwater, and greenhouse gas emissions. Most notably, though, is the ruminant animal, which is beef. If lamb was on the because ruminant animals do produce significantly more greenhouse gas emissions. I do want to say, though, that it's not that black and white. And this is really where sustainability becomes important to contextualize the diet recommendations and how we try to build sustainable and healthy food systems. I think this picture, actually, it's crazy. It's been a year since I've been in New Zealand. Actually, as of today, I left a year ago today because of COVID. But this picture was taken in the Wairarapa near Greytown. And yeah, just this is cattle are the perfect example of showing trade-offs in food systems. For instance, cattle are very important to farmer livelihoods and the economic contributions that they bring, whether that's low, middle, or high-income countries. And particularly in low-income countries, a cow can be your household's biggest asset and most important asset. Beef is also a great source of nutrition when consumed in moderation. It has heme iron, which is very absorbable. It has vitamin B12 and many other, high quality protein, vitamins and minerals. So there's no denying that beef is a good source of nutrition. In addition to that, when responsibly raised and managed, it does have the potential to regenerate land much quicker than if there were no livestock on land. Also, animal welfare, it depends on how the animal's being, raised, whether it's on, a happy field like you see in New Zealand and then the rolling hills, or in a CAFO or a confined animal feeding operation like is very, very common in the States. 98% of pigs, 99% of chickens, and 70% of cows are produced in CAFOs in America. So the vast majority. Also, manure carbon management. Manure can be part of the solution or part of the problem, depending on how it's managed. Also, land use change. This is a really big one. Cutting down native bush or forests to grow food for animals or to let the animals roam is a very grave contribution to climate change and loss of biodiversity. Cattle also aren't really great at converting feed to meat compared to other animals. The feed to meat ratio is 8:1, so it takes 8 kilos of grain to produce 1 kilo of beef. If you compare that to chickens, it's more like 3:1, fish 2:1. So they're pretty inefficient. And as mentioned, they're also the largest agricultural contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So I think this slide does a really good job of showing trade-offs. Like, there are a lot of benefits. There are a lot of drawbacks to over-consuming animal products. So it's not black and white like some people make it out to be. But there is growing alignment on the path forward towards a more resilient, just, and sustainable food system. In 2015, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals really helped kind of set the stage for connecting, linking the different goals globally. And what we found is, through all these documents, is that nature is at the heart of public health in all of these documents. The second one here is the Eat Lancet report. That was a really foundational report that came out in 2019. The one to the right of that, the third one, is the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization doing a joint publication on sustainable healthy diets. I highly recommend that if you have not read it. And then the last one is actually not an agricultural group, but it's actually the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they resonate similar messages throughout. I do want to take a brief moment to talk about the SDGs. The SDGs were drafted by 193 member states as kind of a universal North Star towards solving inequities and promoting peace. These goals are great in that they apply to lower, middle, and higher income countries. No country is excluded from these goals. We all have room to improve, and that's why I really do love them. Many of these do also apply to food and agriculture. In fact, those with the box around it, 11 of the 17, are directly linked to food and agriculture, and arguably you could even put more on that list. So how do we define sustainable diets? If you ask 10 people, you'll probably get 10 different answers. But a lot of the definitions are very, very good, but this one is by far my favorite. It's my supervisor at Massey, Professor Barbara Burlingame, and a team of international scientific symposium at the FAO headquarters came up with this definition, and I'll just take a moment to read it to you. It's quite comprehensive, but I think it really does cover all the facets of sustainable diets. Sustainable diets are those diets with low environmental impacts, which contribute to the food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, while optimizing natural and human resources. I know, as I mentioned, it's quite a long definition, but you can see how comprehensive it is. And this is the report it came from. If anyone's interested, there's a reference list at the end of this webinar. So as I mentioned, I'm working with Food and Planet. It's a nonprofit to empower healthcare professionals and promote sustainable diet patterns. And this is a graphic we came up with to really help illustrate how interconnected the dimensions of food systems really are. And to us, we really feel that there are 4 dimensions that really need to be honored for a diet and the food system to be truly sustainable: sociocultural, economic, nutrition, and planet. Economic is pretty much at the top of everyone's mind when it comes to sustainability. That's nothing new. Nutrition is getting there. Planetary health is kind of emerging in the past few years around food systems. And the one that gets the least attention, in my opinion, that deserves way more attention, is sociocultural. Health, gender, racial equity, cultural responsiveness, whether you're a healthcare practitioner, being able to change your guidance based on cultural preferences and practices, adapting our messaging and programs, policies, so important, and a feature that's often missed. So this is a quote from Johan Rockström. He is an incredible scientist out of the EU. Him and his team developed the 9 planetary boundaries, which is focused on assessing kind of where we are in relation to these 9 boundaries they set. But he said, without a great food system transformation, the world will fail to deliver on both the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Accord. So I always like to ask myself, where is this working? Where are food systems actually sustainable, and where are people healthy? So I guess you could call that a positive deviant, where most people are going in one direction, some people are sticking out. And this is a really neat project called the Blue Zones, where they're really longevity hotspots. Blue zones are the areas in the world where people live the longest lives, and they have the most centenarians, which are people that live over 100, than anywhere else in the world. Although food choices in these 5 areas vary dramatically region to region, Blue zone diets are primarily plant-based, consisting of whole grains, vegetables, fruits, legumes, nuts, seeds. They do consume some meat and some dairy occasionally, but not an excessive amount of it. And they limit their sugary beverages and ultra-processed food consumption. On top of diet, though, they also have additional support in that their community is very strong, they're physically active, and they're generally leaning more towards optimism throughout their lives. So a very interesting case study. I highly recommend checking out Blue Zones more if you have a chance. But this is one of the key points I want to get across today. If you don't remember anything else, this is a good one to remember. Sustainable diets are not an elitist fad. They're not, you don't have to go to, your organic food store and buy the most expensive artisanal products to get a sustainable diet. That's not what it's about. Sustainable diets are attainable, and there is much research out there and much data showing that, a reduction of up to 30% of your individual dietary greenhouse gases is still compatible with nutritional adequacy, affordability, no elimination of food groups, and the ability to be culturally responsive. So the Mediterranean diet is probably the most studied diet in terms of healthfulness and sustainability by far. This is one of the first kind of visuals I remember seeing many, many years ago. This was developed by BCFN or Barilla, Center for Food and Nutrition. And it really links on the left, the food pyramid, which is in the States, we've moved on from the food pyramid. We're now on a plate. But if you could just imagine a pyramid, at the base of the pyramid is what you want to be eating most of more often. And at the top of the pyramid is what you're supposed to be eating sparingly. Well, they actually placed an environmental period related to greenhouse gas emissions and environmental impact to the right of that. You can see that there is significant overlap between what's healthy for us and what's healthy for the planet. Mediterranean diets are foundationally based in minimally processed fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, healthy fats. But there are many diet patterns around the world that may not be studied as much as the Mediterranean diet, but that are also traditionally very healthy and sustainable. So it'll be exciting to see which research comes out around sustainable traditional diet patterns outside of just the Mediterranean. I know the Nordic diet is getting a lot of attention right now, but in the coming years, we'll likely see many more diets that fit into this category. Yeah, so the British Dietetic Association put together a really nice white paper on sustainable diet recommendations. And this is for dietitians and healthcare professionals in the UK. But I think they did a really great job summarizing kind of what it means to have a sustainable diet in an advanced economy like New Zealand or in the UK or the States. So just some highlights from this. It's probably hard to read, but if consumed, red meat should be limited to 70 grams per day or 2.4 ounces per day. Avoid processed meats, increase plant-based proteins. When you choose fish, choose sustainably sourced fish. Consume dairy in moderation. Eat more whole grains, seasonally and locally available foods, and reduce food waste. Now, I don't expect anyone to read this. I know it's very small. This is actually coming out in an upcoming white paper Food and Planet is about to release, but we went through and looked at kind of the leading food-based dietary guidelines for countries around the world. And you can see here on the top row are different countries, various countries. And on the first column are sustainability indicators related to the 4 dimensions and the sub-targets of the 4 dimensions I showed on a previous slide. A green dot means that they've addressed this or at least acknowledged that it is an important asset of nutrition and health. And a red square is that, they didn't mention it. The dietary guideline did not mention it at all. USA is dead last when it comes to this. Our country intentionally leaves out anything related to do with sustainability due to conflicts of interest with industry, to be completely frank. The Scientific Advisory Committee of the Dietary Guidelines of America actually came out and released a report saying that we absolutely should include environmental sustainability, but due to lobbying, that has not been added to the dietary guidelines of last 2016 or the new recent ones in 2020. But I do want to well, before I leave this slide, I should also mention that Brazil is leading the way in this space. If you want to look at any food-based dietary guidelines that are very good, highly recommend checking out Brazil. I made this list before I saw that New Zealand came out with their new eating and activity guidelines updated in 2020. But if it were on that list, it would likely have many green dots. It is a very, very big step in the right direction, and it's really exciting to see that. There's a whole section on environmental sustainability, and some of the highlights from that are, promoting a diet that's largely plant-based, allows for moderate amounts of animal-based foods, eggs, dairy, poultry, seafood, and small amounts of red meat, eating less processed foods, more nutrient-dense foods, limiting ultra-processed foods with saturated fats, added sugars, salts, optimize food safety and the minimization of food waste, which is great, and allowing for cultural preferences and different eating patterns, which is, as we mentioned, a really important piece of adapting dietary guidelines. The other piece that really stuck with me was the Wai Ora, or the healthy environment, which is one of the 3 interconnected elements of Pai Ora. Wai Ora acknowledges the importance of Māori connections to the whenua and the significant impact that this has on the health and well-being of individuals, whānau, hapu, iwi, and Māori communities. So, it's just so impressive. New Zealand's always leading the way, and I miss it every single day. But this just adds to the case of me missing it, and just to see how progressive and valuable that these guidelines can really be. I also just quickly want to mention 2 initiatives that I personally have worked on, or at least know the people of, in New Zealand, to show kind of how New Zealand's leading the way. And the first is the Fruit and Veggie Co-op. This is with RPH, or the Regional Public Health. And there are 11 fruit and veggie co-ops across the greater Wellington region, including one all the way over in the Wairarapa in Featherston. And it's really an incredible program. It's a weekly cost, I believe, of $12 to join the program. But then you get a bag of seasonal fruit and vegetables that are mostly locally produced, with the exception of maybe a rare bananas or pineapples, but most of it's from local farmers. And the estimated retail value of that is more than double that $12 value. So this is a really great way to get fresh fruits and vegetables in large amounts of them into the community, into low resource communities, particularly Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color communities that are lower socioeconomic status and have worse health outcomes. This is a fantastic way to improve access to fresh fruits and vegetables. And I had the honor of working with some colleagues to assess the impact of the Fruit and Vegetable Co-op through qualitative focus group discussions, and just the benefit it brings to the community is just unparalleled. Not only do they love the fruits and vegetables, but they love sharing recipes, sharing food, sharing preserved foods, just meeting each other. It's just a really wonderful program, and highly recommend checking that out. And then the other is KaiCycle, and I'm not sure how far they've spread now, but this was in the greater Wellington region. It's a consumer composting service that collects weekly food waste on bicycles. And I give credit to their team, because they're out there every week, and no matter the weather, and you know how windy and wet Wellington can get. But their compost actually helps supplement and nourish the farm that you can see on the screen here, which is located in Newtown, Wellington. Yeah, and so this is just a quick bit on Food and Planet. These are my other co-founders, Shireen, Kate, Sharon. They're all 3 dietitians as well, and absolutely incredible. I'm honored to be working with them. But we all kind of met a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, to figure out like what can we do. We all have the same passion, and we see gaps in the space, and we really found that we are of the ideology that healthcare professionals and dietitians are the liaison between science and consumers. And if we don't know what sustainable diets are, then how does anyone? So our goal with Food and Planet is to empower 1 million healthcare professionals by 2025. And we're really excited about that. We're well on our way. We've already had our masterclass on sustainable food systems that's available to be watched. And more things coming out. We have a white paper coming up soon, and are in the process of developing a neat tool. So stay tuned. If you want to find out more information, you can go to www.foodandplanet.org, or just reach out to me directly. And lastly, I just wanted to mention some organizations that are really connecting the dots between agriculture, nutrition, health, and planetary well-being. And some of these I mentioned, but mention them again, is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If you have not read any of the reports, they're really enlightening, for better or for worse. The World Health Organization, World Wildlife Fund. Previously they have been in the area of protecting animals and wildlife, but they also now know that food is a huge impact to the sustainability and biodiversity of our planet. So they have actually entered the food space, which is really exciting. Healthcare Without Harm is an American-based nonprofit, but they work with hospitals to encourage more sustainable purchasing practices for their food service operations and for other medical goods. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and the World Resources Institute. So this is my last slide. So I think I'm almost at a half an hour, so good timing. We can open it up for questions, but 3 simple shifts towards sustainable diets. Number 1, increasing your dietary diversity by consuming more whole grains, more legumes, which are beans, pulses, lentils, anything like that, fruits, vegetables, dark green leaves, nuts, and seeds. Number 2 is encouraging sustainable diet patterns, such as swapping beef for beans or opting for sustainably harvested seafood. Simple swaps like that can make a big difference over time. And number 3 is employing strategies to reduce food waste in both our personal and our professional lives. Composting is great, but if we can even reduce it before it gets there, that is ideal. Food waste, as I mentioned, is one of our dumbest problems, but it is contributing massively to greenhouse gas emissions and taking away the opportunity to put healthy food on the table for those who need it most. So yeah, thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
What a fabulous overview, Chris. Thank you so much. And isn't it wonderful to see that we're leading the way with our food guidelines? Thank you for highlighting that. Please ask Chris any questions by typing your question into the question and answer box. Chris, I have a question that often I struggle to answer, and I just wonder, do you have a simple answer for, particularly when we're so far away here in New Zealand, how you respond to people that say, what about the air miles associated with eating more legumes? We don't produce them here in New Zealand, so how do you counter that argument?
Yeah, that's great. A great question that comes up often. And when I first started down the sustainability route, that was one that kind of always confused me a bit. But when you actually look at the data, transportation of food is a very small contribution to the overall greenhouse gas emissions and planetary footprint. Growing the food and wasting the food, if it's wasted, are tenfold more significant than the transportation piece. So my point to that would be flying in legumes is still much more sustainable than the amount of greenhouse gas emitted from locally produced, say, beef.
Thank you. There's a comment here from Rosalind to say that we do produce some lentils and beans. So yes, thank you. Thank you, Rosalind. How do you know if the fish is sustainably caught? Some of the shops or the markets actually state that, but how would we know that?
Yeah, there are some really great labels on the front of packages in New Zealand, and don't quote me on if they're the same as in America. Now I'm kind of forgetting. If anybody knows, they can chime in. But at least in the States, we have sustainably sourced seafood, a symbol, and then Marine Steward Council. Gosh, now I'm forgetting their names, but they do have labels on the front that indicate it. And if you don't know if it's actually a real indicator or not, just pull out your phone and Google it and see what the internet says about it. Usually you can find it out within just a few clicks. The other website I'd recommend is the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I know that they're based in the States, but I do think that they definitely have a global section on which fish we should be eating more often, which fish we should be eating moderately, and which fish we should be avoiding. And they do incorporate environmental considerations into those recommendations, but also health recommendations based on the amount of mercury in each of those species.
Excellent, thank you. Do you support foraging of wild foods as a way to vary your diet?
Good question. Absolutely. So my work in Solomon Islands actually was assessing the sustainability of indigenous food systems in both rural and urban areas, and a huge portion, maybe not a huge portion, but like about 10% of the rural indigenous people's diets in Solomon's came from wild source foods, and the foods that they sourced from the wild were actually at the very top of the most nutrient dense foods in their diet. Lots of wild ferns, leafy greens, even some animals, but mostly dark green leafy vegetables from the wild. So absolutely, if you know what you're doing and know which foods are safe to eat, don't quote me on which foods to eat in New Zealand's eco region, but yes, it is a very sustainable and very healthy way to source a more diverse diet.
Thank you. We have a link here from Forest and Bird about sustainable fish choices. So we'll pop that into our next ANA Focus newsletter. Sustainable and affordable should be complementary. In New Zealand, the two food chains seem to keep prices high. That's not quite sure if that's a question or a statement there. Let's have a look at some of the other questions. Keep your questions coming in. A lot of people saying about Forest and Bird, so that's great. Chris, here's a really interesting question, that milk doesn't have as much impact on the environment as cheese. Why is this?
That is a good question. My guess, we don't have a good answer on this right now, but my guess is because cheese is a condensed form of milk, so therefore a lot of the water weight is removed, and therefore cheese would be higher than milk. You're using more milk to get to that cheese. That would be my gut guess, but I would have to look more into that to give you a for sure true answer.
more processing involved. A question here: when working with clients, what are the useful measures for someone interested in reducing their GHGE through their diet, i.e. how do you measure a reduction?
Yes, so can you still hear me?
Yes, we're still here.
Okay, great.
Just
sorry, my screen just flipped. That's okay, great. Yeah, so can you repeat the question? Sorry, my screen totally blanked on me and I thought I hung up on you guys.
Certainly. When working with clients, what are useful measures for someone entering, and how do you measure a reduction?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are actually resources out there. Gosh, I should be better at this, but if you go to ourfoodandplanet.org and go to the resources section, there are plenty of resources in there that can help you map out your greenhouse gas emissions. There are even particular websites where you can type in commodity food such as quinoa or brown rice or venison or anything, and find the water footprint or the greenhouse gas emission footprint for each of those commodities. That's really helpful when designing healthy and sustainable diet patterns.
Thank you. How do organisations trying to promote sustainability weigh up reports from industry versus health agency?
Yeah, good question. I would honestly follow the data and the science and the civil society, intergovernmental agencies, FAO, WHO. They really are leading the way around kind of digesting where consensus of science is. Industry obviously does have a bias. Granted, that I do believe they should have a seat at the table, but they have vested interest in making sure that their products are continued to be sold. So yeah, I always lean on the side of civil society when looking for reports, and just doing a Google Scholar search and finding if whatever your question is, if there are literature reviews, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses on these questions. This is a pretty highly researched area, particularly now in 2021. So there is a lot of data out there that you can just go look for yourself and come to the conclusion yourself.
Thanks, Chris. There's a comment here as well that's really interesting about suggesting people look to their own cultural history to increase plant food intakes. And in the past, English people, for example, ate water lily roots, tree leaves, and greens, and that are now considered weeds. So there's many more species than now. So fabulous insight into a bit of history that could be looked at.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So when I mentioned that there are 3 species, corn, rice, and wheat, that constitute 60% of global calories, that used to not be the case. There are hundreds of thousands of edible species of foods that are native to each country and each region of the country. We have forgotten those, and the genetic diversity is dropping, but we can change that. We can grow our own foods. We can ask farmers and promote grocery stores to carry a wider diversity of foods. Consumer voice matters. We vote with our dollar. So advocating for a more diverse diet not only helps us, but it's good for the planet too.
Kate has asked a question, as well as thanking you, Chris. There's a number of people who have thanked you very much for your time. So yeah, please take that as a compliment for the fantastic session that you've done. Do you have any suggestions out as to how you best sell a more sustainable diet to clients and whānau? Some are very hesitant to change and also take meat out of their diet. And I guess in these circumstances, we're not suggesting people take anything out of their diet, perhaps just replace it with another, or eat less meat. What's your
exactly.
How do we help? Yeah.
Exactly. Well said. So I was trying to go back to that slide, but my screen stopped sharing. But that slide where I mentioned that sustainable diets are very much in line with healthy diets. There's so much overlap there. So if the client isn't ready to hear that a healthy diet is actually lowering greenhouse gas emissions too, then meet them where they're at. You're not going to convince anyone to change their diet based on something you say. They have to want the change from within. So meet them where they're at. Find out really what matters to them, and try to find foods and diet patterns that are respective of where they want to go, but also respective of health and planetary boundaries if possible. And yeah, to that point, you don't have to eliminate any food groups. I've been vegetarian for 10 years, but I actually recently started adding meat back to my diet when it's available, at a party or with friends, because I don't want to miss out on those opportunities to try a neat dish or try a culturally significant food that somebody's prepared for me. Lamb in New Zealand on Christmas is the perfect example. So it's all about moderation and approaching it with not an extremist attitude one way or the other. Our diets can be malleable and can be inclusive of all food groups, but we have to make sure we find that happy medium in moderation.
And I really like encouraging people to add more things in as opposed to taking them out.
Yes.
That's quite a strengths-based message as well. New Zealand's food guidelines may be nice, this person says, but beef and dairy are our biggest industry exports. How can we move towards a sustainable agricultural system here in New Zealand?
Yeah, good question. Well, my first statement would be to hopefully move towards a diversification of foods, right? Right now, there are only just a handful of animal species that dominate all animal proteins. So how do we diversify our protein sources, whether that's growing plant-based sources or animal sources that are not ruminants, that are less environmentally damaging? There are so many avenues forward. I do remember seeing a webinar from Beef and Lamb a few years back, and they had kind of a multiple paths forward. How do we want to move forward, knowing that sustainability is a very important issue and that beef and lamb is very high in greenhouse gas emissions. And there were, continued business as usual. There was make a niche market for very fine, high quality beef and lamb. So you sell it for a premium, but you don't have to make as much of it, or to diversify it and grow more legumes, cover crops, and that. And I think either this latter two options would be great. Less meat, better meat is a movement that's kind of gaining lots of traction here in the States. Like, if you're going to eat it, make sure it's responsibly raised. Eat less of it, use it as a condiment, but also just diversifying what we grow. It's for the future of our health, for the future of the planet. Diversification is absolutely the way forward.
And that raises a reminder to those of you that didn't see Nadia Lim's webinar last week. Nadia, this is exactly how Nadia spoke about how she's farming in central Otago and adding in a diversity of different crops. It was a fabulously interesting practical insight into sustainable and nutritious diet. So do recommend that you go back and rewatch Nadia's webinar, of which a link is on the ANA website. Chris, seems a little bit odd of me to be asking you about our New Zealand research, but wonder if there's has there been any work on the usefulness of local councils or locals planting fruit trees to create free sources of fruit, perhaps not necessarily just here in New Zealand, but anywhere in the world?
Yeah, that's a really niche but interesting question, and I'm glad you asked. I know in Wellington they had programs around having the community come pick excess fruit in your backyard that you weren't going to use, and giving that away to food banks or to community members in need. So I know that there are some programs in that space. In the States, there have been government programs. I'm thinking Seattle, Atlanta, that have created food forests that are on public land. So they are community driven, I think volunteer based, but there may be some paid employees as well. But it really is a food forest. I've been to it. It's fruit trees, nut trees, a variety of kind of edible crops that are available for anyone to take within the community. So if you are hungry or you need something to eat, you're welcome to go to that forest and grab a bite, no questions asked. So there are some pretty innovative ways that people are integrating more fruit and vegetable crops within their community. And I think that's a great way forward to regionalize our food system, to not rely on imports as much, and to really create as much resiliency as we can, especially, I mean, we've seen in COVID how it can disrupt the food system overnight. So really food sovereignty, working towards ensuring that we have access year-round to healthy and nutritious foods.
There's a comment here suggesting that more of us become UN members, and then we could have a greater impact on the sustainable development goals and the delivery of each country. Do you agree with that?
Any way you can get more involved is great. Yes, I don't know if we're going to be at the United Nations making decisions in the coming weeks or months, but we there's a great organization that I worked with in New Zealand called the United Nations Association, and they are an organization based in Wellington, but they have branches all across New Zealand, and their primary goal is to promote the goals of the UN and the SDGs. So if you are interested in becoming more involved with promoting SDGs, particularly in New Zealand, highly recommend checking out UNANZ. That's the United Nations Association of New Zealand. And right before I left, we actually threw a really neat climate event at the Wellington Botanical Gardens. We had Chloe Schwarbach there. We had representatives from Kai Cycle and a variety of other kind of climate-oriented events and initiatives across Wellington. And it was a very successful event, and so much energy in that space. And that was sponsored by the United Nations Association.
That leaves us on a fantastic note, positive note, Chris. What we'll do is we'll share a number of these websites and contacts in our next ANA focus. So please send us any links that you have to info@ana.org.nz, and we'll happily share that along with the Forest and Bird Sustainable Fish information and including your presentation, Chris. Fantastic to talk to you from so far away. Really such a lovely mix of pragmatic advice from you here today. So thank you for your time. Best wishes for finishing or completing, getting your results of your PhD. We look forward to being able to call you Dr. Chris. And ka kite and all to you all. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.